is still loading. I don't think it's recording yet.
It's saying that it's recording on my side.
Yeah, now it is recording. Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks so much again, Selina, for joining me today to have this discussion about the chapter that you wrote together with Kaniki Jailubaeva on faith actors and violence against children, which is obviously part of the state of the evidence document on religions and development that JLI have been working on for a couple of months now. Yeah, shall we start by you telling me a little bit about what the actual problem is when it comes to violence against children? I'm sure as an academic you have lots of numbers and figures ready to just throw at us. So yeah, do you just want to outline the issue a little bit?
Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer. And just to say, violence against children involves many different kinds of things: physical, sexual, emotional violence, but also exploitative and harmful practices, child labour, child marriage, corporal punishment, sexual violence. So a real range of different kinds of things. And obviously that wider commitment to child protection of children from abuse. But, latest statistics, 2020, we know that almost half the world's children experience violence. That's nearly 1 billion children. And this is a regular occurrence every year. Every 7 minutes, an adolescent dies because of violence. And certain children are more likely to experience violence, for example, children with disabilities. This has an enormous cost to our world, those costs, and 3 out of every 4 young children are subjected to corporal punishment under the name of violent discipline by their caregivers. We need to remember that children also live in sort of contexts of structural violence, conflicts or disasters or emergencies, many children living in those spaces, and they're often not fully protected by the law. Only 12% of children are fully protected from corporal punishment by the law across the world. So we see, certain states still sanctioning certain forms of violence against children. We also know that children experience violence from other children. Students aged 13 to 15 actually experience bullying. Close to 130 million, more than 1 in 3 young people experience forms of bullying. So, it is a real problem in our world today. And faith, I suppose, has a mandate for the most vulnerable, children being part of that, and a sort of a commitment to kind of try and respond in positive ways.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Selina. Yeah. Yeah, gosh, that's awful. I mean, to be honest, sometimes I wonder how we manage to do this kind of work without all getting depressed, because that's obviously numbers, right? You're giving us there, but behind every single of these numbers, there is a child, there is a person, right? An individual who's suffering.
Absolutely. And maybe sort of just to kind of comment on that. I mean, these numbers are terrifying, especially in the light of intergenerational cycles. We know that children who experience violence may have a higher risk factor as adults. But I think it's also an opportunity. Every child that's born into the world, we have a new opportunity to create a safe and enabling violence-free environment for those children. So change can happen, and change can happen quite quickly if we're able to change some of those kind of social norms. And that's a very important role which faith actors can play, which I think we're going to talk about a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting. You've kind of already made the transition there to the next question that I was going to ask. So the role of faith actors, the role of religion. I mean, I really am not an expert on violence against children, but I have been working on religion and development more generally, right? Like the role of religion in bringing about social change. So yeah, that's really something I would be interested in. What do you feel are some of the roles that faith actors can play? And then to link it back to the chapter that you and Kanki have written for the State of the Evidence document, maybe the broader question is, what have some of the key debates been in the literature in the last 20 or so years?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. And, our summary, which was also based on a longer scoping study that I did in 2019 with my colleague Carola Iber, and Kathleen Rutledge, really focuses on the last 2 decades. What is the state of the evidence, and tries to give a bit of a feel for some of those things. And what we see is that faith actors have made important steps forwards. We see 2 important global declarations around ending violence against children: the Kyoto Declaration in 2006, and that kind of went alongside, the World Report around violence against children, where there was a lot more attention being paid to this particular issue around the world. And then the Panama Declaration in 2017. And in these, global faith leaders have come together to really look in more detail about how they can be part of the solution, but also to look critically at where religion can be part of the problem, and can actually be a roadblock for change on certain issues. So the study focused on both of those dimensions. And if we kind of turn to the literature, where we looked at a sort of 172 different sources, we see there's a lot of grey literature. Grey literature in a sense dominates the evidence base. A lot of international NGOs kind of working around this area, working with children. That's quite a common area for sort of faith-based organisations. So we do see academic research, but we see a lot of grey literature and organisational sort of work being done, which often has a positive slant. It's focusing on talking about all the positive things that they're doing. We do see a little bit of a bias. There's a lot of material from the USA and from sub-Saharan Africa. And we also see a bias towards Christianity, more literature focused on Christianity and then Islam and then traditional beliefs. So it's just interesting noticing some of those kind of, I suppose, biases or tendencies within the literature itself. But then moving on to the content, and it's maybe tied to some of that reality about the kind of evidence we're seeing. There's a large percent of the material that focuses on guides and training guides. So it's very practical. How do we train faith actors on these issues? So mobilizing and educating faith leaders in particular around this issue. And that's a really big focus. A second focus we see is around child sexual abuse. And this really has been an area that's emerged, in a number of sources, but it's had a lot of publicity in the last few years. There have been commissions in Australia, in Ireland. There's been issues particularly around the Catholic Church, but literature shows that we see it in other denominations, in other faiths as well. The perpetuation of violence in relation to faith. Child sexual abuse is a focus, but also other issues where children are being abused within religious contexts. And then a final area was the intersection with research on gender, religions and development. So this speaks to obviously one of the other chapters in the evidence guide. But there was a lot of literature around harmful practices. And this is situated within violence against women and girls. So this wasn't a focus for us but we see this increasing crossover between violence against women and girls and violence against children. And we see this particularly around sort of adolescent formed harmful practices. And the reason why I'm highlighting that is it ties to a point I'm going to make later, where boys may then get left out because there's a lot of focus on women and girls, which is understandably needed. But it can mean that there's more focus on girls than boys because they fit within both of those bodies of literature. And there's very important work being done around shared root causes between violence against women and violence against children. So look, I think I'm probably going to kind of pause there. There's certainly been an increased focus in the last 10 years in particular, arguing that faith communities and faith actors really need to be recognised as key actors in local communities in particular, because they're already often involved with children and can be involved in child protection activities. And there's a recent study, I'll pick this up later maybe, but there's been a focus on how do you explore child rights through the lens of different faith traditions. So bringing together the languages of human rights and religion. But at the same time, there's been a body of literature that's highlighted, faith can be a problem, particularly around certain kinds of practices that are often seen to be justified by religious texts. And that's an area I'm going to talk about a little bit more later on.
Yeah, thank you, Selina. That's so interesting. I was actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking that you mentioned that there's a lot of grey literature, and then you also spoke a little bit about which parts of the world a lot of the publications focus on, right? And then also what you just said about this overlap between literature on violence against children, but then on the other hand, there's also the literature about violence against women and girls, human rights discourses that overlap with debates about religion. So I was wondering while you were speaking, like who who writes these publications, right? And who produces this evidence? I know this is a big question and you might not have an answer ready for that, but maybe can you just share some informal reflections? Is it, so you've already said it's mostly grey literature, and I'm assuming this is written by practitioners or commissioned by development or human rights or children rights organizations?
Yeah. So maybe let me just give you my informal impression, I suppose. And just to highlight that my focus in the study was a series of consultations with experts around the world. And I'm going to speak about that a bit more. But, because in the sort of literature, there is a dominance from the North. And there's a dominance by certain large international faith-based organizations. We can think of organizations like World Vision or Tear Fund or Christian Aid, who write up their work or commission research around what they're doing. And while that is very important, it can mean that there's a reinforcement of particular narratives, maybe, and there's a focus, as I said before, on the positive, because grey literature is often reports that are brought out to kind of justify funding and justify interventions. They add an enormous amount, and the advantage is that they are practitioner focused. Of course, they're documented practice-based knowledge, the experience of practitioners, but they do that through the prism of large international organizations. Smaller organizations can't normally necessarily afford to do publications, and again, it's often maybe organizations that are more likely to be based in the North. So we see a bit of a sort of emphasis on positive examples because of who's writing. And maybe, therefore, we see that only a small percentage of the literature maybe focuses on some of the more problematic areas. And it's maybe more from the sort of the wider world outside the faith-based space. There's been a body of literature and, a body of media focus around the perpetuation of violence. So we do see maybe a little bit of a difference between the writing that's done from within the faith sector, very positive about the roles of faith, and maybe some more critical research that's done particularly kind of maybe within the women and girls space and violence against children, social sciences space, that highlight the interpretations of religious texts that may be supporting forms of violence. So there's a sense there where religion is seen as a liability. So I suppose our study seeks to kind of look at both of those dimensions and to go deeper than what we've seen in literature to ask experts what they're seeing about both of those sides. So, the literature is important, but actually there's trends emerging, especially around child sexual abuse and corporal punishment, which I'll talk more about in a moment, that sort of the literature hasn't necessarily caught up with. So it's interesting, I think, to get practitioners' perspectives from the field, because then we can say, well, what's actually really going on? And maybe just one final thing to highlight about that. We can see declarations, the Kyoto Declaration, the Panama Declaration, and they look fantastic on paper, and they are reflections of changes that are happening. But there's also a disconnect between maybe a global narrative, when certain people get together and they make a declaration, at the global level, and the realities of local faith communities. And I think this is a gap that I want to highlight. Maybe in the literature we see more the global discourse, even though we're using case studies and experiences from the ground. But it's also important to talk to practitioners who are working within local contexts, because the narratives in local contexts may actually be very different to the narratives at global level. So I just wanted to kind of flag that. And that was something we tried to sort of take into account by not only doing a literature study, but by actually talking to practitioners on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's so interesting and so important as well. And it's really something that we've been trying to do more at the JLI, right? Where we also traditionally, we have been, I mean, JLI has been around for 10 years now, right? And it really started in these global circles, right? Where people who worked for international agencies, for some of the big INGOs, felt this frustration that religion wasn't really addressed. And then in subsequent years, we started focusing more on the regional and the local. And this is really what we're prioritizing at the moment, because there is this tension. And in the global circles, it's local voices usually that get marginalized or completely excluded, right? Yeah, so this is it's interesting that it came up in your research as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And look, I come from a practitioner background. So when you're working, particularly in the African context where I'm based, faith's all over the place. If you're working in local communities, faith's already present. It's not a decision about, do you bring it in and engage with it? It's already there. And I think this is something we need to kind of bear in mind when we sort of think around global discourses, as we said, we sort of talk sometimes as if we decide whether or not we want to engage faith actors or faith systems. Those faith actors and faith systems are already very present and affecting at many, many levels how things are getting done in many, many contexts. So the question isn't really, we don't have the luxury of saying, do we want to engage faith or not? Faith is present. The question we have to ask really is will faith be a liability or an asset in relation to the work we're trying to do around ending violence against children? And I think it is important that we frame it like that. That's not true everywhere, but it is true for a large part of the global south, particularly if we're looking cross-faith, which we are. Faith is an incredibly important part of the majority of people's lives, and they're not able to detach their faith beliefs from the reasons why they do things and what they think is the right thing to do. And therefore, in the development world, we can't do that either, even though there can be a temptation sometimes in certain technocratic discourses to kind of leave faith out. My sense is that locally that's not possible for people to do. So it's kind of trying to engage with that reality. Yeah, let me stop there.
Yeah, and then I guess the question is then, do people who work on the global level and who work in these big organizations, do they catch up with this local reality, right? Like, are they up to date, and do they know what's happening? Yeah.
Sure, exactly. And I think it's also, to not pick either a very positive lens on faith and religion and, and only work in that space, or to sort of stand outside and criticize it. I think, we did work around the ambivalent role of faith. And I think it's important that all of us are able to recognize that faith can be a really good thing, but it can also do harm. And I think the more that all the different types of organizations are able to recognize that, the more we can have a shared approach moving forwards, where we're able to talk about the difficult things and the challenges, but we don't use that as an excuse to ignore faith, because I think that's also very unhelpful. So my hope, and what our research showed, is the real need to build alliances between, so-called faith-based and so-called secular organizations, so that we have a working together that is actually productive. And this means we do have to talk about faith, but it also means we have to talk about faith critically, and not just kind of bring it in as a solution either. And I think I'm going to highlight that when we look at some of the major current debates, because those have maybe created tensions around the issue of faith and whether violence against children, advocates and activists want to engage with faith or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, because this was going to be my next question, actually. So you've
I'm jumping ahead of you.
Yeah, we're in sync, Selena. It's good. It's good. Yeah, because you've outlined like the big debates of the last 20 years or so, right? And highlighted some of the cross-cutting themes, and even the gaps. I mean, I actually want to come back to the gaps later, but
Sure.
Before that, I wanted to ask if you feel that there has been a change over time. So we've had these last 20 years or so, right, where we've been speaking much more about the positive and negative, the constructive and sometimes maybe not so constructive role of religion in these spaces. And do you feel that maybe in the last, 5 years or so, or roughly 5 years or so, do you feel that has there been a change? Is there new topics that are being highlighted? Like, what are there trends in the literature on religion and violence against children?
Absolutely. Look, and I want to highlight that I have seen really positive trends. And there's more recognition that faith leaders and faith actors are an important stakeholder, and they're being engaged. And I think there's been more willingness by certain international faith-based organizations to talk about the difficult things. And I think the Panama Declaration reflects that, a recognition around where faith has maybe done harm and talking about that. And I think, both sort of moves from both of those sides are really, really positive. So in a way, what I want to highlight is some of the current debates in the 5 years, which have been difficult debates, are actually incredibly productive for moving forwards. There has maybe in the past been silences or taboos around certain things, and I'm going to share 2 examples of that. But I think starting to open up that box and speak about things that are difficult is actually an incredibly important part of engaging faith. So whilst those conversations have been difficult, I think they're actually incredibly productive for moving forwards and for some of the unique roles that faith can play. So I want to give you two examples. The first one is corporal punishment. So corporal punishment really emerged across multiple faiths as a sort of site of contestation. So we see, examples within different religions of the supporting of this, using sacred texts, different sacred texts, including the Bible, to claim that, corporal punishment is mandated, is a religious requirement, or is allowed by religion. And we see this around other harmful practices, such as child marriage or female genital mutilation and cutting. So we see ways in which religious scriptures can be misused. But at the same time, we've seen some really promising work being done that contests that. And reinterprets those scriptures. And I think this has been a really important shift to start talking about it, to actually challenge that normalization in an area where faith actors often have huge impact in families and around parenting practices. So I think voices and global pronouncements condemning corporal punishment, key people who have been ambassadors, Desmond Tutu's been an ambassador around ending corporal punishment, the rise of movements specifically around that and global partnerships, I think has really helped to create a discussion around this. That discussion isn't resolved. There's still contestation, but there's really positive resources that are able to start to seek to address this issue. And I think that's incredibly positive and very important. I think if faith actors aren't able to speak about this issue, they're likely to be marginalized from the global debate, because the global debate has very clear stance on this issue. And sometimes they see religion as part of the problem. So that, I think, is an area where we're seeing significant positive movement. The second area I want to highlight, and I've got three areas, I think. The second area I want to highlight is child sexual abuse. So this also came up, large in literature, but also in my consultations with experts. And, look, part of this is tied to the Me Too movement and revelations that have come out and commissions. But because of those revelations and commissions, there's been increased attention to this issue. We see in-depth investigations taking place in Ireland, Australia, in the US, and we therefore see increased attention to this. So this is an area that's been historically very silent and taboo within religious communities and within families and communities. So, and we see that this, sex and sexuality is often a bit of a taboo topic in religious settings, but breaking that silence in faith settings has been huge. And I spoke to many experts around the world who really said, we're going to focus on breaking the silence and not being complicit with these sorts of patterns that are happening. And we see new initiatives emerging, child protection systems, safeguarding processes to make sure that faith institutions are safe spaces for children and that they don't sort of have special dispensation to be exempt from legal requirements from everyone else. And this, whilst again, it's a very difficult area and very, very sensitive, it's an incredibly important area of focus. And it's very, it's really nice to actually see these conversations happening and actual practical work being done on the ground. So I'm gonna stop with those two issues. There's a couple more trends I can talk about in terms of two things that I've seen kind of emerging as trends, but maybe I'll pause there before I go into that, in case there's anything else you want to pick up on there.
No, I don't actually have any questions right now. I have some for later. So
okay, let me maybe, and I'll do this really, really quickly. So two trends which we see is that we know that faith actors are playing important roles at multiple levels. At the level of the child directly, they often have, trusted access to children, which can obviously be both a positive and a negative thing, but they play important roles in families, but also wider communities, and we even see it at national, international policy levels around the world, particularly in certain countries. So if we think about the child being surrounded by that socio-ecological system, those multiple levels, we see that faith systems can offer this significant social capital across all of those different levels. So I want to highlight that way in which it plays a role in the socio-ecological system. But the additional thing that we noticed in the study was the cross-cutting role of faith beliefs. So faith beliefs influence people through that whole system, the children themselves, the parents, the community, and international politics. And therefore the important role of what we've termed spiritual capital. And this emerged as a key learning of the study itself, that it's not enough just to engage faith actors instrumentally, can you let us in the door, the access that you give us as gatekeepers and the social capital that you offer, people, volunteers, spaces, but actually the spiritual capital that faith brings as a system. And this is a really, really important insight. And it's an important insight for transforming social norms, which we know from the World Health Organization's package of strategies for ending violence against children. Transforming social norms is one of the key things that needs to happen for change to be brought. And as a result, we need to take seriously the way in which faith actors can play a role in transforming social norms by digging down into the beliefs and values which kind of underpin them. So I've gone on about that a bit, but it's actually a really, really important insight from the study as a whole. And it's been taken across into other spaces around violence against women and girls and the role of faith leaders with UN Women. So I just want to highlight it because it really did emerge as a unique role which faith actors can actually play. And I mean, the final thing just to say is that there's a lot of ways in which faith actors are responding informally. And this isn't always documented. And I think the challenge is that there's a lot going on at local level that doesn't get documented. And there's a risk that we only document the formal responses. Faith communities often provide an informal safety net for so many children. And I think it's important when we think about more rigorous documentation, which we definitely need, that we don't only reduce that to the formal ways in which it's involved in formal child protection systems, but we look at that informal safety net, which is often provided by faith communities, and we try and document that as well.
Yeah, great. No, thanks so much, Selina, for outlining that. That's so interesting. So it's basically 4 points, right? You started with corporal punishment, then sexual violence and exploitation. Then you spoke about spiritual capital of faith as a system, right? And the role of faith systems and on faith communities and transforming social norms. And then the fourth was a need to also include informal responses. Which is so interesting because this is, I told you, I'm really not an expert on preventing violence against children, but this is something that comes up in our other work a lot as well. So I think this is really something that people who are familiar with work in this area more generally can relate to because it's a general issue, right?
Absolutely. And it's about what counts. I think, there can be frustration when people maybe come from the outside and bring new formal programs in. There's not always a recognition of what is already happening on the ground because it's not necessarily done in a particular kind of developmental way. But that doesn't mean that it's not happening, and sort of recognizing that. And this is part of decolonizing development, I think, as well. Recognizing what is already happening and the strengths and assets within that, I think, is important, and not just kind of coming in with something new. And you're right, this isn't just with violence against children, it's across many, many thematic areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, no, that's all really interesting and great. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I still wanted to ask you 2 questions. And
okay, I'll be short in my responses, I promise.
Okay, great. So the first question was about gaps, and I mean you kind of already touched about on that, right? So just now the informal responses, that would be one gap, and I think at the very beginning of our conversation you also highlighted some gaps, right?
The gap between the global and the local. But look, there were a couple of very specific gaps, and I'm just going to name them. I'm not going to go into talking about them because there's not time. So we see gaps around addressing the specific risks to children of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, so LGBTIQ issues, and that's a real silence. And, it's a silence that's often particularly strong within religious communities, and that silence can perpetuate violence. I raised the issue about boys, that boys' vulnerabilities can be invisibilized because there's maybe more of a focus on girl children, and the need, I think, to understand that gender includes boys and not just reinforce gender stereotypes. We do see the rise of digital violence against children, and I haven't been able to speak about that much, but that's certainly something emerging in the last 5 years or so, and especially under COVID-19, and the need for more capacity to be developed for faith actors around this issue. That's a huge one. And then just mentioning that, look, there's structural forms of violence that affect children's lives. I mentioned conflict, but child labour, migration, homelessness. We sometimes think violence against children is sort of just hitting or just kind of one-on-one individual violence. But actually, we also need to look at those more complex areas, which some organisations do, but to recognise that there's structural forms of violence that affect children as well. Yes, that's it. So 5 more little gaps for you, just highlighting there. I'm going to stop. There you go. I did it quickly.
No, great. It's great. Thank you, Selina. And I mean, this we want to encourage people to actually read the chapter, right? So if we explain,
yes, if you want to know more,
read the chapter. Yeah, no, yeah, great. Thanks so much, Selina. Really, this has all been very, very interesting. Maybe, the last question to finish this conversation off, about recommendations or key takeaway points. What would you like people who listen to this conversation or read the chapter, really want to know what were the key highlights from your research? What do you want them to take away?
Sure. And one thing I definitely haven't been able to speak about enough, and I really want to encourage you to engage with it, is the importance of child participation. So I haven't been able to speak about this enough, but part of what came up in the research was the risk that children are perceived to be inferior, to sort of be inferior legally and socially and sometimes even spiritually, and is sort of placed at the bottom of a hierarchy. And this came up as a real challenge. But one of the ways to counter this is to place the child at the center. So to listen to children, to allow children's voices to be heard, and that this is been identified as a really promising practice. And we see the World Council of Churches and a number of different initiatives that place children at the center. If children can be seen and heard, this starts to create a different kind of container around how children are viewed. So I just kind of want to really highlight that as kind of an important aspect that kind of came up. So we've already said these things about, faith communities and faith actors need to be seen as part of the wider community. They're not seen separately. They're part of engaging a community-based response around the different systems of care. And they should be involved within that wider system and not kind of separately. I've highlighted that issue around engaging the specific mechanisms of spiritual capital. This is a unique contribution, and it needs to look at two things. One, promoting positive beliefs and action. And there's many, many things within all faith traditions that place children and the needs of children and vulnerable groups at the center of their requirements. But at the same time, there's an urgent need to reinterpret the religious beliefs and practices and the misinterpretation of these that may contribute to violence against children and may contribute to it being silenced because it's a taboo. And this involves us engaging with sacred texts and religious texts, and there's some really good resources around that. So it's kind of really saying, yes, faith actors, engage with those, of course, but also engage with the religious belief systems, because these are intergenerational systems. And it's important to engage with those systems as well as the actors, because those systems actually shape the realities within which many children are growing up. And it's important, I think, to engage with all of the dimensions of that. And this is where faith actors can play an important role, of course, because they have unique authority and influence to be able to engage with those dimensions, and to do that in a way that's interfaith. So there's some promising forms of interfaith engagement, which isn't always easy. But when we see this, we also see academics and practitioners collaborating together. So we see shared messaging. It's not my faith is better than yours, but it's actually collaborating together. And I think that collaboration, academics and practitioners, but also different faiths coming together to take shared approaches is really important. I think everybody can do that in their community, wherever they are, that we don't create new silos, but we actually find ways to kind of work together, and that we talk about the difficult issues. Issues that are taboo and sensitive are incredibly important to talk about. And sometimes as faith communities, and I'm a lay faith actor myself, we shy away from those because they cause dissent. But actually, it's one of the most important things that we can do, to talk about those difficult issues and to find ways forwards that are in alignment with our faith. It's a spiritual calling to protect children. And, we shouldn't see it as something which somebody else is bringing in and making us do. It should be a commitment from within our different faith traditions themselves. Yes, let me stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Selina. Lots of food for thought, lots of really important points that have come up in the discussion. And I just want to thank you so much again for taking the time to share these findings that are explained in much more detail in the chapter that Kaniki and you wrote for the State of the Evidence publication. So everyone who's listening to this conversation,
please go and read the brief. And look, to recognise that points to lots of different evidence elsewhere.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, and I mean we have been having the violence against ending violence against children hub at GLI for quite a while. So there are lots of resources available as well on the GLI website and the resource library, but also on the hub page. Your research of other people working in the sector. So there's definitely plenty of evidence to dig into if people want to know a bit more. Yeah,
absolutely. And look, there's good resources. It can feel overwhelming, this kind of topic. You know, we heard those statistics at the beginning and you think, oh, you know, that's how can we even start? But there are really good resources. And I think it's just important to highlight that like everyone can do something.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really nice note to finish this conversation on. So let me look for the stop recording button. Yep, here it is. So thanks again.
Thanks, Jennifer.